Uhuru, you're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and joining us on the line is Dr. Horne. And Dr. Horne is a prolific writer, and his latest volume is the Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the role of American fascism. And Gerald Horne is going to be doing a show called The Real Story Revealed, a deeper dive into Juneteenth with lessons for 2022. And that's on, could you talk about that tomorrow, Monday? That's tomorrow, right?
Monday, June 20th on WPFWFM.org. That's the Pacifica station in Washington, D.C. 3 hours, 7 to 10 Pacific, 9 to 12 Central, 10 to 1 Eastern. Riding shotgun will be Greg Carr of Howard University.
Greg Carr is a man that I have a ton of respect for. I mean, he is a man that's kind of he's like you. He's from Hank Aaron to Shaka and the Zulu man. I mean, he can talk about the history of African people from ancient Kemet to like I say, Shaka and the Zulus. And by the way, how is your research doing on your Egyptology book?
Oh, it's coming along well. The latest tangent I'm on is, as you know, for a good deal of the period from about 1500 till the end of World War I, in a formal sense, Egypt was being ruled by Ottoman Turkey. And Ottoman Turkey was an enslaving country, but to be fair, it enslaved Europeans and Africans alike. So my latest tangent is exploring the Afro-Turks, who are centered in the Turkish city now known as Izmir. They mostly have roots in Sudan and what we would now call Eritrea. And something that I think Africans, particularly in the United States, should know is that in 1923, like two baseball general managers, Turkey traded their Greek Christian population back to Greece, and Greece traded its Turkish Muslim population back to Turkey. And I've thought about that a lot in terms of with the right surging to power, where they try to trade all of us, for example. You know, the late Derek Bell, wrote this story about how we were all traded to some place in outer space. But right. I'm not sure if that's in the offing, but I don't know. Maybe if they trade us to Cuba, I might endorse
it. I've heard some people, I met a sister from Jamaica many years ago. She was saying that same thing, that if she had to go to any other country to be traded, she would rather be traded to Cuba than be in the United States. Yeah.
And of course, now, for those who listen to the program Freedom Now on KPFK, you know that last week, not yesterday, but a week ago, 8 days ago, we interviewed the Oxford historian, Sebastian Page, who talked about the attempt to send the U.S. Negroes to Brazil, to Ecuador, to Colombia, to Cyprus, to Australia. The problem was nobody wanted us, so we're still here.
And I think your sister, I know your sister wrote a book, and she talked about the Hornes. Your roots are from Angola. Is that on your mother's side, father's side, or do you? Could you talk about that?
Well, I'm not really sure. You'd have to. My sister wrote a book about our family called Mother Wit, and it's probably in that book. And I read the book, I even previewed it. But I have to say, I know more about the history of other families than my own.
All right. Now, Melinda, you have any questions?
Well, I think we should get into the U.S. coup situation.
Hey, it's very serious. I've been watching the hearings about the attempted coup, January 6, 2021, and also the reaction to it. Now, there's a trend on the left which dismisses the coup as being just Democratic Party talking points. But the more problematic response has been from many of our Black liberal friends who are paralyzed. They don't know what to do because it's clear, and it was trumpeted just a few days ago, that the last legitimate presidential election may have taken place on November 2020. The Republicans are not planning on losing any more presidential elections. And that may happen because they tried to overthrow the government and nobody's really been punished, at least nobody at the top. And Mr. Trump still has a solid base of support, and people don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to confront it because, as I've said 100 times or more on this program, they really do accept the mythology about the United States, that the creation of the United States was this sturdy experiment in democracy with a small d, and that the arc of the moral universe bends a long way, but most of all to justice, and that the United States is proceeding step by step towards a more perfect union. You know, the usual propaganda you hear. And so they can't really process the idea of a coup d'etat. It doesn't make sense to them. And so it's the sort of development that leads to gloom and doom. And I should also say that the evidence presented is quite startling. Mr. Trump might have a defense in terms of a criminal trial. First of all, if he's tried outside of DC, he'll probably be acquitted. DC, he won't be because it'll be a mostly Black jury. But if he's tried in Atlanta, he'll probably be convicted because there's a criminal case there too. But he has a solid base of support. There's no doubt about it. Something like 70% of Republicans think that the 2020 election was stolen. They accept the big lie from Mr. Trump because they basically, well, the way I've explained it, and I explained it this way on WPFW just this past Friday, that it reminds me of what the US pundits used to say about Yugoslavia when it was breaking up in the 1990s. They told us ad nauseum that the problem in Yugoslavia was that the socialists and the left had chased nationalist passions underground, and the nationalist passions had never gone away. And then they reemerged in the 1990s with Serbs fighting Croats and Slovenians fighting Serbs and Bosnian Muslims fighting Bosnian Christians, etc. And so you could apply that to the United States, that there's been a lot of propaganda against white supremacy. But if you paid attention to any of the efforts to, say, desegregate the schools in Boston or Little Rock, you saw that these people, they were not in favor of that. That's why they were rioting. That's why people got killed. And so now these passions are coming to the surface because, in a sense, they never went away. And let me give you another footnote. Gustavo Arellano, who is a Chicano columnist for the Los Angeles Times, who I read, and I would suggest that other people read them too. So he did a column a few days ago about white supremacy as it manifested itself in these killings, like in Buffalo. He said he got a ton of mail from people defined as white objecting to the criticism of white supremacy. I mean, even Joe Biden has criticized white supremacy. So this is where we are in the United States. And as I said, people don't know what to do. They're paralyzed. And I don't know, keep the light on for me in case I have to scurry across the border.
Yes, sir. I remember I was doing a show on a radio station in Brampton, Ontario, And I remember I played Oscar Brown Jr. song, Bitter Men, and I followed it up with Do You Remember the Days of Slavery by Burning Spear. And I received a phone call from a Euro-American in Buffalo, New York, threatening to take my breath away. I never will forget that. Yeah, he was incensed that I would have the nerve to play, those two songs back to back, one from Jamaica and one from a black man from Chicago. Oh my God, he was upset, upset, really upset. And could we talk about the religious fratricide in Nigeria? Now I know that my father, today is Father's Day, and my father was we always laugh, me and my sister, we laugh because we can't figure out whether or not our father was an agnostic or an atheist. Because I remember me and him used to have discussions, not arguments, because I didn't have enough nerve to argue with my father, but we would have these discussions. He thought the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was just another Baptist preacher. And I would always argue that, or discuss that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, how many Baptist preachers do you know that would refuse to go to war at 42 years old and go to prison? And my pops would still maintain that, the messenger of Allah was, he just thought, he didn't believe in the Nation of Islam at all, but most of the family, the majority of the Richmond side of the family, or many of them, men and women, were in the Nation of Islam.
Well, the situation in Nigeria is quite dire. The executive summary is that you've had a number of massacres, I'm afraid to say, inflicted upon Christians by religious zealots who refer to themselves as Muslims. Plus, you've had the killings of Christians by religious zealots who refer to themselves as Muslims on the grounds of blasphemy. I'm sure you're familiar with blasphemy. It's considered to be a high insult to a particular religion. And this is all in the prelude to what inevitably will be tumultuous elections in Nigeria. The situation is quite dire, at least in certain parts of the country. I don't want to over dramatize it, but it's something to keep a close eye on. And let me make one more point. How many people? It's something to keep an eye on because it's not unique to Nigeria. You have something similar unfolding in Mozambique, thousands of miles across the continent to the southeast, where religious zealots who call themselves Muslims are on the march, which caused the Mozambican government to bring in Rwandan soldiers who are accustomed to combating genocide to help to put down this insurgency. And of course, I could have referred to other parts of Africa as well. Sorry to interrupt. Go right ahead.
You're talking about Rwanda now. Kagame is Paul Kagame, the head of state of Rwanda, is known to be in the pocket of Israel, and I think he was trained in the United States. Isn't he bad news for progressive forces worldwide?
Well, it depends. I mean, if the Rwandan military can help to repress this insurgency of religious zealots in Mozambique, I say more power to them. But certainly Rwanda's press coverage of late suggests that they need to hire a new PR agent. The latest news, of course, is the fact of this multi-million-dollar deal with London, whereby London will send all of its refugees to Rwanda. That is to say, if you're from Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever, and you make your way to the UK, you're going to be on your way to Rwanda. Now, there's been litigation that's held it up, perhaps temporarily. And I should also say that there's another conflict with Rwanda and its neighbor, speaking of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that is, whereby the Rwandans are charging that the DRC is sheltering Hutu zealots who Kigali says were involved in the genocide of 1994. At the same time, the DRC is charging that Rwanda is sheltering people they consider to be, quote, terrorists, unquote, who supposedly have affiliations to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Now, as the lawyers might say, I'm just quit claiming these news items to you. I'll leave it to your crack news team to unpack these stories.
Yeah, Melinda, you have the next question, please?
Yeah, let's move on to Ukraine. What's going on in Ukraine?
Well, you may have seen the news of Chancellor Scholz of Germany, President Macron of France, and Prime Minister Draghi of Italy traveling to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky. It does appear that the resolve of the North Atlantic countries is cracking. In part, this has to do with the fact that obviously in gaming out this conflict with Russia, they did not plan on this inflation, which is rocking the economies, particularly the United States of America. You have places in the United States of America where the price of a gallon of gasoline is $10 a gallon, believe it or not. Now, admittedly, the usual price is about $5, but still, that's considered a lot here. Not to mention food prices, baby formula crisis, tampon crisis, and of course, the tampon crisis is exacerbating gender relations because the ultra-right is claiming that the tampon crisis is due to the growth in the transgender phenomenon, believe it or not. So this is a very serious conflict that the North Atlantic countries had not bargained for. And I've watched part of the St. Petersburg Forum where President Putin spoke. That was just this past Friday, and he suggested that there was a new world order in motion. Just before that, President Xi Jinping had called him. They had a chummy conversation. China also has just launched its newest aircraft carrier, which is comparable to the most modern, sophisticated aircraft carriers in the United States of America. So this is a very serious crisis, and I did a piece. You can find it on the Facebook page under my name, just this past Thursday, in conjunction with the December 12th movement in Brooklyn, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And
yes, sir.
One of the points that I addressed in my 8-minute address was that for the progressive forces, particularly the black left-wing forces, the question you should ask yourself is this: would we be better off if NATO were to prevail? Would we be better off if another NATO escapade in Libya, 2011, were to be duplicated? Which is not necessarily beyond the realm of imagination, since with all of these boycotts on Russia, it's obvious that Europe is going to have to turn to Africa for gold, for oil, for natural gas, and all these other items that they say they're not going to get from Russia. And I would hope that our friends on the left come to realize that.
You're listening to Dr. Gerald Horne, Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. You mentioned St. Petersburg, and I'm thinking about St. Petersburg, Florida. And my favorite sprinter at the moment is Trayvon Bromell. I'm really hoping that he's been blazing the track this year, and he's been known to blaze the track. And then when it comes to the finals, big meats. He's almost like the brother from Asafa Powell. You know, something always happens to him in the big meat. But let's move on to the elections in France and Colombia.
Well, France, we should have the results soon. And the press is telling us that the left will not prevail. I'm speaking of the joint ticket of the communists, the socialists, the Greens, and the former Trotskyist leader who leads the ticket, Jean Mélenchon, who did quite well in the first round a week ago. If they claim a majority, he will be prime minister, believe it or not. That will have seismic consequences for the global correlation of forces. But even if he's not prime minister, if the left does well, that bodes quite well for the future. With regard to Colombia, I'm optimistic that Gustavo Petro, who is the left-wing candidate, will prevail, although, to be honest, things do not look promising. But I'm hoping that I'm wrong and that he will prevail, which would also have major consequences for the elections in Brazil in a few months, major consequences for Colombia's neighbors, speaking of Venezuela, major consequences for US imperialism, Canadian imperialism. So a lot is at stake with regard to these two elections in South America and Western Europe.
And we're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of a brand new book called The Counter Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Another question, Melinda?
I don't know if you want to go into the NBA and like the Major League Baseball league.
Well, I confess, I lost my bet. The Boston Celtics did not prevail, which I had trumpeted. The Golden State Warriors prevailed, and I was proven wrong. And I'm disappointed, needless to say, not only because the Boston Celtics star, Jason Tatum, has roots in St. Louis, Missouri, my hometown, but also their other star, Jaylen Brown, is probably the most politicized player right now in the NBA. And I'm happy to say that he has roots in a city I used to live in, speaking of Berkeley, California. But he's been quite prominent on the anti-police terror front. But alas, the Golden State Warriors prevail. Now, with regard to baseball, I'm sorry, I'm turning everything into something related to my hometown teams. But I mean, who can deny it? I mean, the New York Yankees are tearing up the league. I mean, it's really quite something. I expected Toronto to do better than they have, but they've been left sprawling in the dust. And if everything goes according to the way trends are now projecting, you can expect the Yankees to face off with the LA Dodgers in the Fall Classic.
Let me say one thing, that Jason Tatum is only 23 years old, so he's got a lot of time left, you know, if there's no injuries or anything. So I think I'm a big fan of Mr. Tatum. Does he have Mississippi roots, or do you know?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Well, let me ask you this question. There are many people born in St. Louis. Many of them have roots like yourself in Mississippi. Is that the majority? Well, my uncle Lucius went to St. Louis. I mean, he went to St. Louis after he left Simsboro, Louisiana. But do you know the breakdown of the people that came to St. Louis, where they're from all over the South, or mostly from Mississippi?
I would say the plurality of Black people in St. Louis have roots in Mississippi. But I had good friends I went to high school with who had roots in Arkansas, which of course is the southern border of the state of Missouri. Tennessee borders the state of Missouri. There are lots of connections between Memphis, right on the Mississippi River, and St. Louis, just right due north on the Mississippi River. So the joke we used to tell, and it may have been true, is that when people migrated north from Mississippi, or I should say fled from racist terror, that the people with the least amount of money could only afford a ticket to St. Louis, and then people with a little more money made it all the way to Chicago, and the people with the most money made it all the way to Detroit.
That reminds me of a joke that Ilombe Brass used to tell. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought my phone had dropped. But Ilombe Brass used to say that our folks from the southern part of Florida, Georgia, and South and North Carolina would come on, and the conductor would say, "Newark," and they were so slow that they thought they said New York. So that's how Black people got to Newark as opposed to New York, and that's a joke that Ilombe used to tell, which I love Ilombe Brass, but it's when I really think about it, it's not really funny.
Well, speaking of Ilombe and Mississippi, let me point to you a new book. I haven't interviewed the author. I'm debating whether or not I should. The book is called The Artistic Activism of Ilombe Brass. It's published by University Press of Mississippi. And it basically has a lot of Ilombe's drawings and cartoons with commentary. And it's worth picking up, but I'm not sure if I'll interview him though.
Reason why not, if I may ask?
Well, so he has these cartoons where Ilombe is poking at Malcolm X, and then
I remember
the editor is, because Ilombe, he grew up with Malcolm, so he knew him from the time he arrived, because Ilombe was no spring chicken. And then the guy who makes the annotations of Ilombe's cartoons accuses Ilombe of anti-Semitism, which I thought was unwarranted. And if you notice on my interviews with these authors, I try to make a comfortable space for them. And I really don't want to get into challenging authors. So if I think I'm going to challenge an author, I usually just pass up the interview.
I understand. Well, I remember when I first moved to Detroit, and I lived with General Gordon Baker Jr., and I remember when I walked into, when I started living there, one of the first books I saw was I think his name was Color. The book was called Color Them Colored, I think. And General had a copy of that particular book because for a brief moment, General was a member of the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement, which was formed by Carlos Cooks, who took over the Garvey movement after the Marcus Mosiah Garvey passed away. But Carlos Cooks was some of the aspects of Carlos Cooks I really love, but Carlos Cooks, to be perfectly frank and above board, his anti-communism never. I couldn't deal with his anti-communism because when Fidel Castro came from Cuba to New York, Comrade Carlos Cooks refused to meet with him, but Malcolm X met with him, and I guess you had some dealings with Carlos Cooks' followers as well, Dr. Horne.
Well, more so through Ilombe, because Ilombe and I were very good friends and worked closely together, myself, Ilombe, and Samori Marksman from the Caribbean. So I had a lot of respect for Alambe, and I would not want to be party to any forum where his reputation is besmirched.
Well, let me say that, you know, Ilombe, as you know, was a firm anti-imperialist. While he never denounced Carlos Cooks, was definitely not in the anti-communist camp. You know, he was let me put it this way, he was a firm anti-imperialist, which I'm sure you will attest to.
Hear, hear. And let me just say in closing that once again, 10 to 1 Eastern tomorrow, the federal holiday Juneteenth, myself and Greg Carr of Howard University for 3 hours on WPFWFM.org, breaking it down.
I will be listening. I'm sure if Melinda if she's can listen, she will be listening. And I encourage all of the listeners of Diasporic music from Cape Town to Nova Scotia to turn in and check out Dr. Horne and Dr. Greg Carr, who is no slouch when it comes to the history of African people. Like I say, he's a man that can take you from Kemet to Washington, D.C.